Welcome back to another episode of Philosophy and You. We've made some changes around here, and we think you're going to like them. Since our last episode of Philosophy and You, we wanted to know what you thought about our program. And the results were illuminating, to say the least. A critical mass of these testimonials expressed concerns exhibiting certain common themes. You told us how we've impacted your life and how we've made you feel about philosophy. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're proud to present the new, improved Philosophy and You. Yay! Yay! As part of the new and improved Philosophy and You, we're introducing a segment called Let's Talk Philosophy, in which we match our prodigious philosophical insights to your banal questions. Today's question comes to us from Arnie Schlepper of Schlubville, Wisconsin, submitted as an audio file.
Hello. I have a major problem with De Anima Book 3, Chapter 3. I need to know how come Aristotle says at 428b 18 to 26 that some kinds of sense perception are more likely to be wrong than others. I mean, if he thinks that the qualities of color and odor, texture, sound, and flavor are always perceived accurately, and he does say that at 427b 11 to 12, how can he think things like shape and size are more likely to be perceived incorrectly? I just don't get it. I think that concept of Phantasia he introduces in this chapter might have something to do with it, but I just can't figure out what it is or how it works or what that has to do with error. Help me, Philosophy and You.
Thanks for your question, Arnie. We can help you, and we'll do so by going over Aristotle's model of perception, his conception of what Phantasia is and how it works, and finally the role Phantasia plays in perceptual error. Let's start out with a general definition. Aristotle defines perception as a movement in the body stimulated by the action through a medium of an object of sense perception upon a sense organ or sense organs. Aristotle distinguishes three objects of sense perception. First, the special perceptibles, second, the common perceptibles, and third, incidental perceptibles. The special perceptibles are the sensible forms of an object, its qualities of color, odor, sound, flavor, and texture or tactile quality. Each of these qualities is perceived only by a special single sense suited to it. Sight perceives color, hearing perceives sound, smell perceives odor, taste perceives flavor, and touch perceives tactile qualities. The common perceptibles are those qualities of sensible things whose perception does not belong to any single special sense, but rather are perceived by more than one sense. In De Anima, the common perceptibles include shape, number, movement, rest, and magnitude, although Aristotle later adds to these bluntness, smoothness, sharpness, and roughness in De Sensu. Incidental perceptibles are things that are not perceived as what they are in their own right, but only perceived as what they are incidentally. For example, the son of Diares and the son of Cleon are not, as a matter of sense perception, perceived as son of Diares or son of Cleon, but instead as things of a certain color, sound of voice, size, etc. From the standpoint of perception, that these boys are sons of Diares and Cleon, respectively, is incidental to the perception that they are white things with distinct vocal qualities, distinct hair color, and smaller size than their respective fathers. Now that we've seen the three types of sense perceptibles, let's consider an example of Aristotelian sense perception using our highly affordable and hastily drawn friend Bob. When Bob perceives the orange color of this orange, the sense organ appropriate to that sensible perceptible, the eye, receives the sensible form of the orange color, but not any of the matter that makes up the orange itself. In this way, the sensible form, or sense perceptible, The special perceptible appropriate to perception by the eye has acted upon Bob's eye and made it like the orange. Whether it has done so physically, making Bob's eye physically orange, or spiritually, making it orange in some form without matter, is still a subject of much scholarly debate. Once Bob's eye has received the alteration that occurs in the special senses when they are acted upon by a special perceptible, the heart, as the primary sense organ, receives those alterations through the flow of blood. In this way, with its center localized in the heart, the vascular system, on Aristotle's model of perception, performs much the same role that the central nervous system does in modern scientific explanations of perception. Now that we have discussed Aristotle's model of perception, we can discuss Phantasia. Introduced in De Anima, Book 3, Chapter 3, Phantasia, Aristotle tells us, is that in virtue of which an image, or phantasma, arises in us. Often translated as imagination, Phantasia refers to the capacity to retain the image of a perceptual object in the sense organ that perceived it, and to call that image up in cognition. Unlike reason, which Aristotle attributes only to human beings, phantasia is found in all animals, although Aristotle later in Chapter 3, Book 3, distinguishes between sensitive imagination, which all animals with sensation possess, and deliberative imagination, possessed only by those animals that can calculate between desires and actions. Despite much animal and some human reliance upon the images produced by Phantasia, not all of them, Aristotle reminds us, are veridical. In a famous example at 428b2-5, Aristotle explains that while the sun appears to us to be perhaps a foot in diameter, our judgment tells us that it must be larger than the inhabited part of the earth. Because such images can be inaccurate, and they lack reason to recognize these inaccuracies, animals, Aristotle tells us, spend much of their lives in various states of error. Now we're ready to answer Arnie's question about the relationship of phantasia to error and sense perception. Warning! What follows is the author's analytical, interpretive, and academically unauthorized attempt at an explanation of the relationship among Aristotle's claim that perception of the special perceptibles is never or almost never in error, Aristotle's hierarchy of the susceptibility of types of perception to error, and the relationship of phantasia to 1 and 2. Cite at your own risk. Describing the differing likelihood of perceptual error in cases of special, incidental, and common perceptibles, Aristotle explains at 428b18-25 that perceptual error is least likely in the case of special perceptibles, somewhat more likely in the case of incidental perceptibles, and most likely in the case of common perceptibles. But why this progression? In general, I think the greater the reliance of the agent upon phantasia in her perceptual judgment, the greater the possibility of perceptual error. This is the relationship of phantasia to perceptual error suggested by the hierarchy Aristotle suggests at De Anima 428b18-25. Indeed, if we follow Aristotle in De Anima, Book 2, Chapter 6, 418a24-25, the point he makes about the special perceptibles being the objects of perception primarily suggests that their perception requires nothing like phantasia for their completion. That is, we recognize immediately that red is a color, or the odor of meat cooking is an odor. We do not need to open up the possibility for error entering from our cognition. If we take Aristotle's strong claim that the perception of the special objects of sense is never in error, or admits the least possible amount of falsehood as an extension of this limited possibility of cross-modal perceptual mistakes, then those strong claims do not seem ridiculous. Indeed, are we likely to mistake a sound for a flavor, or an odor for a texture? Clearly, phantasia plays a greater role in the errors made in perception of incidental perceptibles. Consider, for example, misidentifying the white thing I see down the road as Cleon, when it is really Crito. What is incorrect in my perception of the incidental perceptible, i.e. the white thing in question is not what or who, I thought it to be, is that the unity of the special perceptibles I perceive is an image of the wrong person. Indeed, combining all the special perceptibles into the image of Cleon, or Crito, or anyone else, requires Phantasia, and thus an element of cognitive activity that is not needed in perception of special perceptibles. In this way, Phantasia both makes possible identification of subjects exhibiting the special perceptibles and their misidentification. Phantasia plays an even greater role in instances of error in perception of common perceptibles. Consider the examples below. The sun appears to be a foot across, the lizard near my eye appears to be gigantic. Error in the perception of common perceptibles, shape, motion, rest, magnitude, etc., reveals the limitations of any single sense. Sight is sufficient to perceive color but not magnitude, as is evidenced by the perception that the sun is a foot in diameter. The farther away the object, the more unreliable the perception, Aristotle explains. Even more so than in cases of perception of incidental perceptibles, the most unverifiable perceptions involve the common perceptibles, i.e., nobody can go to the sun to see if it is round, or if it is as large as we think, and consequently the greater role Phantasia plays in shaping whatever perception is possible. On my reading, Aristotle's claim that the perception of the objects of the special senses is never or almost never in error both makes sense when understood as a point about the extreme unlikelihood of cross-modal perceptual error, and helps explain Phantasia's role in perceptual error in a way that illuminates why Aristotle thinks error in perception is more likely in the case of perception of common perceptibles. Well, once again, the writing is on the wall, and it's time to bring our program to a close. But don't worry, we'll be broadcasting again from our delightful new studio location. Of course, we understand how disappointed everyone is that we've come to the end of yet another Philosophy and You program. Just remember, our program isn't Philosophy and You without you.